Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining us from all time zones. We're very happy to welcome you to MENTEE's professional development session. And this is called Making Your Story Stick, Communicating a Mission Efficiently, Effectively, and Authentically. And we have Tony Cohn, Director of Strategy for the Morgridge Family Foundation, in partnership with the Simmons Center for Global Chicago. MENTEE is a global organization whose goal is to disrupt the status quo of structural inequities and provide open access to learning, guidance, development, and mind and body healing sessions, as well as offer enduring guidance and teaching from global mentors for marginalized individuals worldwide. My name is April Dinellen. I'm co-director of the Simmons Center for Global Chicago. The Simmons Center is a nonprofit center in the heart of Chicago, connecting global development and human rights organizations with a footprint in Chicago and working around the world, as well as with international communities right here in Chicago. Along with my colleagues, Joan Sherman and Fabiola Avila, we're happy to co-host this event with Letitia Zweikert and MENTEE. MENTEE is a member of the Simmons Center. Please remember to keep yourself on mute during Tony's presentation. We'll open the floor to questions afterward. At that time, I'll invite you to raise your virtual hand via the button on Zoom, or feel free to drop questions into the chat. If you'd like to share information about your organization, you can add a relevant link to the chat as well. And now I am delighted to welcome Tony Cohn to lead the professional development session, Making Your Story Stick, Communicating a Mission Efficiently, Effectively, and Authentically. Before starting his role as Director of Strategy at the Morgridge Family Foundation, Tony worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where, among other achievements, he created the Smithsonian's award-winning podcast, Side Door, in 2016. And it's still going strong, 168 episodes in, having reached 3 million people in its first 2 years. He's currently working on a master's in social innovation from the University of Cambridge, Trinity Hall College. We really appreciate having his time and expertise today. So, Tony, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, April, and thank you for that thoughtful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to talk a bit about how to make your message or story stick. Just going to start with a bit about me. I don't want to repeat what April's already shared, but I am currently Director of Strategy for the Morgridge Family Foundation, which is an innovative philanthropy out of Denver, Colorado. I encourage you to check out our website. It's thinkmff.org to learn more. We also, shameless plug, just released our annual report, which would love for you to give a read to. As April mentioned, I also started my career at the Smithsonian, which is the world's largest museum research and education complex, where I managed Smithsonian-wide projects across our 19 museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. The reason I share all this is when it comes to making a message stick or needing to get stakeholder buy-in for an organization, a project, an idea, I have lots of experience that I'm excited to share with you today. And for me, when it comes to getting buy-in for an idea, a mission, and inspiring action, whether that's from a funder, a member of the media, an internal stakeholder, it really comes down to 2 things. It's first, the way that we show up as an individual, as a leader in communication. And then secondly, it's the way that we talk and communicate and convey our ideas. And so I'm hoping today that I can give you a tool to do both of those things. I cannot promise that this is going to be a silver bullet or the only way to make a message or a story stick as you're communicating the missions of your organizations or a new project, but I'm hoping it can be another tool in your belt. And so I'm going to center our conversation around really 2 different concepts. First, the way that we show up around this idea of authenticity and authentic leadership. And then secondly, around storytelling and the way that we communicate and engage. I'm going to start with this quote. People take their cue from you. And we're going to return to this in a moment, but just let that sink in and think about it for a moment. People take their cue from you. Now, as April mentioned, I'm pursuing my master's in social innovation from the University of Cambridge currently. And last semester, I focused on this idea of authenticity and authentic leadership. And what was so interesting to me in the research that I did is the definition of authenticity. It comes back to this Greek proverb, to thine own self be true. And before I dive too much into that, I want you to take a second and think, when was a time that you were authentic? When you feel like you showed up authentically for somebody else, it could be personally, professionally. Think about that for a moment. Now, with this root, to thine own self be true, with authenticity, what's so interesting to me about this, interpreted to mean being authentic is acting in ways that align with our values and beliefs, is there's nothing about the way we're perceived by others. Rather, being authentic is first being aware. What are our values and beliefs? For me, those are things like honesty, optimism, empathy, trust, and then acting and behaving in ways that align with them. Oftentimes, I think of being authentic as something that's perceived by others. Am I being authentic? Do they think I'm being authentic? Rather, this idea of authenticity is, are we showing up in ways that align with our values and beliefs? Only we can know that to be true. So now let's talk about authentic leadership. And do me a favor, think for a moment of a leader, a person in your life who you could say they're authentic. That is somebody who's an authentic leader. Think about that for a second. Now, the key difference between being authentic and being an authentic leader is it's all about perception. Authentic leadership is, am I a person who's being perceived by the people who I want to mobilize as acting in a way that aligns with values and beliefs? Wherein being authentic is an internal sensation. It's, do I know my values and am I acting in a way that aligns with them? Being an authentic leader is, am I allowing myself to be perceived by others as doing the same? So I want to return to this quote for a second. People take their cue from you. It was advice given to me early in my career. And what I think it means, at least for me, is that the way we're perceived, our perception, has a direct impact on our ability to influence and inspire others. And so with that framing of authenticity and authentic leadership and how we show up in the way that we communicate, I want to pivot and talk a bit about storytelling and some strategies that I've used in the past to convey messages in a way that have inspired action from others. And I'll start with this quote by Maya Angelou. At the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did. They'll remember how you made them feel. Okay, so we've talked about how we show up is important. That's being authentic and being an authentic leader and being aware of our values and then making sure that we behave in ways that can be perceived as others as being self-aware and being values driven. Now let's talk about a communications technique that can make our story stick. Whenever I'm communicating with another person about, it could be a mission of an organization that I'm working for, it could be a project that I'm trying to get off the ground, it could be an idea. The work for me always starts with this question. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? And I want you to do this exercise for a second. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. You can feel free to get a piece of paper and a pen or just think in your head, but be specific. It could be for your organization. It could be a project that you're working on. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? Okay, that wasn't quite 30 seconds, but I'm gonna keep going with an example from my own career. So when I was at the Smithsonian, as April mentioned, I was able to start a podcast. And when I was asked this question, what's the problem you're trying to solve? I would answer, well, I'm creating a podcast because we want to make our museum collections more accessible for folks who can't visit our physical locations in Washington, D.C. Now, that's an answer to that question. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? But what I've learned in my career is our tendency to start with the what and then talk about the why. And what I mean by that is the what is a podcast. What's the problem I'm trying to solve? I'm creating a podcast. Why? Because it's going to make our museum collections more accessible to folks who can't reach us in person or visit our locations in Washington, D.C. But what if we flip that? What if instead of starting with the what and then talking about the why, we do the reverse? And I'll use that same example to illustrate what that can look like. So what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Well, we need to make our museum collections more accessible to people who can't visit us in Washington, D.C. And that's what's so interesting about a podcast. A podcast would remove that traditionally physical experience of walking around a Smithsonian museum and instead transport listeners wherever they were into the behind the scenes hidden world of the Smithsonian. Do you see what I did there? Instead of starting with the what or the podcast, I started with the why, the problem that it could solve. It's a minor flip that makes the message much, much more compelling and stickier to your listener. So what makes a message stick? So far, we've talked about three things. We've talked about showing up authentically, which requires, okay, what are my values? Am I behaving and acting in ways that align with them and that can be perceived by others to be values driven? Two, understand the problem that you're solving inside and out. And then thirdly, speak about it strategically using that why what method rather than the what why method that can feel a bit more intuitive. And then there's a fourth piece, and this is perhaps the most important: listening. Once I've done the work to understand the problem that I'm trying to solve, when I'm trying to get buy-in or engage a new funder or a member of the media or an internal stakeholder, I always start with this question: what is the problem you're trying to solve? Why? It's because it allows you to assess what that person's needs are, what the problem they're facing is, and then position yourself as a solution. And again, I'll use that same podcast example as to illustrate what this can look like in action. So as I mentioned, the Smithsonian is this vast network of 19 museums, 9 research centers, and a zoo. And when I was building this podcast, it required buy-in from all of those different entities. And there were two ways that I could go about that buy-in. I could go around and give a presentation and say, hey, I'm building a podcast and I really want your museum to be involved and we can feature your collection items and the folks behind your researchers who are behind those items. Or I could sit down with them and speak to those professionals and say, hey, when it comes to making your museum collections more accessible, tell me what's the problem that you're currently trying to solve. And what I heard time and time again was people thought that the museums were just full of stuff, but that they weren't seen as having the active research that was going on behind the scenes constantly. And as I listened to that, it then allowed me to, one, agree with that problem. Yes, the Smithsonian is perceived as this treasure house of stuff, but it's really our people that make it special. And what if we had a podcast? And a podcast, what's so amazing is it would feature the voices of those individuals, connecting folks with the people behind the stuff that they love. And suddenly, the conversations that I was having with folks internally, trying to get their buy-in behind this new big idea, was first, we agreed upon a problem that we were both trying to solve. Then we talked about a potential solution. It made it so much more compelling and stickier of an idea, rather than me going in and saying, hey, let's talk about a podcast. Here's all the benefits. Instead, we started with this, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? I listened and then was able to position what I was creating as the solution to that problem. Now, if you couldn't tell, I'm not a big fan of having lots of text on screen, but I wanted to make sure that I left something super tactical for folks to look at. Screenshot this. I'm happy to share this presentation with April and Letitia and the fine folks at MENTEE as well to make sure that you all have a copy. But this is what we've talked about. It's how we make a message stick. First, it starts with being an authentic leader, which means being self-aware. It means asking questions. What are my beliefs and values? Do I act in ways that align with them? Is my behavior perceived by those around me too as well? Second, understand the problem you're trying to solve as deeply as your solution to it. Our tendency can be so solution-oriented. It's my organization that's going to solve this problem. It's this idea that's going to solve this problem for the organization. Flip that. Instead, think, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? And then how can I position myself as the solution to it? Third, listen to the problems that others are trying to solve in your field. And then think to yourself, is there a connection between that problem and the solution that I'm offering? And so with that, those are some strategies that I've used throughout my career to make a message stick. I'm really excited and grateful to be here and look forward to an awesome conversation with April and then taking questions as well. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. And just to reiterate, we will, with his permission, share Tony's presentation. So you've got those notes to remind you as well. And I would encourage those of you, if you would like to join in the conversation, if you have a question, you can either drop it in the chat or you can raise your hand. We'll keep an eye out for that as well. And you can have a chance to ask your question directly.
Come on.
The first thing I'd like to kick us off with is a lot of people that are here in the conversation are coming from the nonprofit sector. And you talked a lot about your work at the Smithsonian when you were on the on that side of things, but now you're on the funder side of things and you're evaluating grantees. And I was wondering, in addition to your example of how you have made this work in your own work, would you also provide us an example of from the funder side of what you've seen your grantees do, either very effectively delivering that authenticity, or actually some, kind of not naming names, but some challenges maybe where you saw somebody didn't, they kind of missed the boat on this and how that might have impacted them or what they might do differently.
Absolutely. So thank you for the question, April. As a funder, I'm constantly listening to nonprofits who need funding and are making requests for different resources. And I think the mistake that folks can sometimes fall into, at least in my experience, is immediately going into a sell, if you will, or immediately talking about their organization. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but immediately talking about their organization and then figuring out and then asking the question at the end, is this the right fit? How can we partner? People generally love to talk about themselves. So whenever, what I've found is when folks in those conversations really start with trying to understand from a foundation, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? Like, what is it not only that we do, but how do we think about investing resources in education? Where are we thinking about that right now? What's of interest? It then gives them an opportunity to effectively do that thinking about, okay, if they're trying to solve for youth entrepreneurship, how does that fit into what I'm doing? And then to talk about, to agree with the problem. Actually, sometimes folks make that problem even a little bit worse. So there's some urgency behind it, and then position themselves as a solution. An example of someone who's done this effectively in the past is MIT Solve, who's a grantee of the Morgridge Family Foundation. And we started as a member of that organization and thought that they were compelling. They were really explicit with their values as an organization. They're about supporting pre-existing tech-driven innovations, for-profit, nonprofit. They have a kick-butt network of philanthropists and social entrepreneurs and industries that all kind of participate in their marketplace. And when we started engaging with them and making an investment, they didn't come at it in here are the projects that we want to be funded, which is best. Instead, they said, tell us what the problem is that you're trying to solve as a foundation. And then they backed into that. And the example I used previously was a real one in way of youth entrepreneurship, because that was an area that the principals of our foundation were trying to figure out, how could we make social entrepreneurship more accessible for youth so that they could have a sense of agency over solving problems in their community. MIT Solve heard that, and they didn't create something that then became a project that we could fund. Instead, they were honest and said, we're thinking about that as well. We have an idea for how we could get that off the ground. What do you think about solving that problem together? And we ended up coming in. So short answer to your question, I think the trap that some people could fall into is immediately entering conversations with funders with the organization that they're representing and the solution that they're offering, rather than having a conversation about the problems that both a grantee and a funder are trying to solve, and then working together to figure out how resources could be a shared solution to that.
Thanks, that's really helpful. One of our attendees, who's also a Simmons Center member, just dropped a question in the chat asking how can you utilize this strategy for a complicated problem, but with a very short conversation period? So what's the best way to try to get into the complexities of the problem that you're solving when you have, maybe a little bit longer than your elevator speech, but essentially you're trying to get a funder's attention or a partner's attention, somebody's attention, and you've got a lot of nuances there. Do you have any suggestions for that?
So I always do a gut check with myself when I'm getting a new idea off the ground or communicating about a project or a mission or an organization. And my gut check is, can I explain it to a 5-year-old? Like, if I can't explain this thing super simply and directly, there might be a challenge behind it. And I've seen this done. I've gone through this exercise with everything from a podcast to, when I was working on the podcast, like water, algae, filtration systems. And I think going back to my presentation around what's the problem you're trying to solve and doing that work, part of that work is being able to talk about that problem to every audience from every angle. So I think there's a quote that someone said, say it simple, stupid. And that's like, I think about that a good deal. Can I talk about something super simply? And that doesn't mean dumb it down. It means talk about it quickly and effectively. So I guess my answer to that question is, I would return to what's the problem I'm trying to solve. And then if it's helpful, really do the work of how could I communicate this in 1 sentence, 2 sentences, a paragraph, a novel, etc. But I would try to anticipate that need before you're in that moment, if that's helpful.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And another question that I wanted to raise was, you talked about some ingredients for being authentic, and you touched on authentic leadership as part of as a version of authentic, but could you talk a little bit more about the ingredients around authentic leadership as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's three ingredients to being an authentic leader. And this is through some researchers here in the US. Avalio, A-V-A-L-I-O, I believe is how you spell the lead researcher's name. And they say that being an authentic leader is 3 things, and they build upon that definition of authenticity that I provided. It's first, being self-aware. So that's basically like being authentic. Am I aware of my values? Second, self-regulation. So am I able to not only behave in ways that align with my values, but am I doing the work in my head to intentionally make decisions about how I am acting authentically or displaying my values through behaviors to others? And then third, most importantly, is positive modeling, which means serving as an example. So am I then effectively showing others, am I able to act authentically in ways that, am I able to act in ways that align with my values and beliefs that is being perceived by others? So that was not my best run through of those 3 ingredients, but quickly, they are 1, being self-aware. So do I know what my values are? 2, self-regulation. Am I doing the work to filter, acting in ways intentionally that align with my values and behaviors? And then third, positive modeling. Am I actually being perceived by others as acting in ways that align with my values? Which sounds like the same word over and over again, but they're actually quite nuanced. And they've done research, and then I'll get off my soapbox on this, but they've done research on perceived and ascribed authenticity by leaders. And what that means is they've looked at leaders and then gotten information from that leader. Did they think that they were acting authentically? And then did their followers perceive that leader as acting authentically? And the positive benefits of authentic leadership, which include increased trust from followers, more likelihood to be innovative in their behaviors because they have a higher trust in their work culture environment and in that leader. It only works when followers perceive their leader to be authentic. It actually doesn't matter if the leader believes they're being authentic or not. So this idea of positive modeling and being perceived as acting in ways that align with values by followers is the critical piece for an authentic leader.
So I want to dig into that just a little bit. We have another question in the chat, but I'm gonna take the follow up here before we get to that one. And just ask, so what if I really think I'm being very authentic and I don't know how I'm perceived? What's a good way to try to get a handle on how others are perceiving you? Who can you, do you have to kind of have your kitchen cabinet of people to bounce ideas off, or, how do you get that feedback to make sure that your authenticity, that your values are coming through the way you think that they are?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. The first is doing the work yourself. I think as social impact professionals, we can think that we are values driven. And for me, I first interpreted that to mean like, I work for a values driven organization. I get to make the world a better place. Therefore, I am values driven, but really it's personal values. So what I talked about earlier in the presentation around optimism and honesty and empathy, I had to really do the work to like list out what are my personal values so that I could understand, are they showing up or not? To your question about how do I know if that's true? Yes, I think there's a kitchen cabinet in way of, we should always be getting feedback from people around us. That's the short answer. But it shouldn't just be your kitchen cabinet or those closest to you. I would encourage as well going to the basement, if you will, in this kitchen cabinet analogy, and asking folks who aren't on your personal board of advisors or who don't interact with necessarily every day, and ask either through an anonymous survey or just through candid conversations, and be honest and vulnerable. Say, I'm trying to figure out how I show up as a leader and to be authentic. And I'd love to hear from you. What do you perceive my values to be? And don't lead with these are what I think my values are. Instead, just ask the question, and it can be surprising to hear what others say and what others don't say.
That's great. That's really helpful. And I'm sure there's some tools if you do a little searching on, assessment tools that are not, high-end consulting fees to be able to.
Oh,
to
no. I mean, I when I was trying to figure out, like when I was doing this work myself, which was inspired by my graduate research, I think I literally Googled like list of personal values. And then that helped me have a menu, if you will, not to aspirationally say, I want to be this, I want to be that, but to really do the work and think like, yes, I sure, maybe it's aspirational and I'm humbled to believe that I am this, but to really put together that list for myself that I could use as my North Star in the way that I show up and engage with others. And most importantly, when I'm interacting with somebody or giving a presentation and it doesn't go, I have this like pit in my stomach where I'm like, something didn't feel quite right. Oftentimes I can return to those values, my authentic values, and say, wow, you know what? I wasn't being empathetic there, or wow, I wasn't being honest, or I'm such an optimistic person in that situation. I wasn't being values driven. Why was that the case? That's the critical thinking piece that's so important.
That's very helpful. So turning back to the chat, another one of our participants today, Irene, thank you for dropping the question, is how do you deal with a situation where prior to the conversation, you believe you have all of the points that you were mentioning pinned down, but you're asked a question about your project or about your story that throws you off, and you don't have that concrete answer ready. How do you pivot in that situation when you're not, you're prepared, you think you're prepared, but then you get something that you weren't quite ready for? What's the best way to go?
It's such a good question because you can only anticipate so much. There are two things that come to mind, and I hope this is helpful. The first is, as a nonprofit, the need for funding can be so urgent that we're willing to go to any length necessary to get it. And it can be so hard when somebody asks a question. I'm speaking from my time at a nonprofit. It can be hard when we're asked a question that isn't necessarily relevant to our work, to be honest about that, because we want that funding. And I think the two things that I'm thinking about is, one, when we're asked a question we don't know the answer, I always appreciate as a funder when a nonprofit says, you know what, that is a great question. Let me think about that and get back to you, versus trying to spitball or think of something on the fly, if that's the kind of thinker that person is. The other is, if somebody asks a question that isn't aligned with the problem you're trying to solve, how can you be helpful to that person and understand that maybe it's not the right funding fit? And by being helpful and saying, you know what, as you ask that question, I'm not sure if that's what the problem that we're trying to solve, but I do know somebody who is, and I'd love to connect you. Because by being helpful, it's only going to strengthen your relationship with that funder or with that person, and do them a favor that you can, that will increase your reputation. Those are the two things that I kind of, that immediately come to my mind. One is the best brands aren't for everyone, and let's be helpful. And then the second is taking a breath and saying, you know what, that's a great question. Let me get back to you on that.
Yeah, that's great. And I do think for nonprofits, it's very easy to fall into the trap of trying to be all things to all funders, and to lose a little bit of your authenticity as you are trying to fit yourself into whichever funding box happens to be available, and it might not be a great fit. And so maybe to recognize, like, you know what, that's not exactly it, that would, and it could turn into a longer term helpful result in the end. So I think that's a great thing to think about. We have a couple more questions. First from Kevin, who's with one of Simmons Center members, Fuego del Sol. He says that funding tends to follow the latest crisis, but data supports that long-term implementations and local co-created projects are better at addressing crucial human needs. So, and I've seen this in the philanthropy sector where, it's kind of the flavor of the month or the season of, what's the hot thing to be funding right now. So Kevin goes on to ask, can effective communication assist in encouraging social impact funders to follow the data rather than longstanding social heuristics such as spend it by the deadline or lose the funding? So how can you communicate better, using the data piece rather than just the trendy piece?
It's such a great question, Kevin. The answer is yes, I do believe that effective communication can assist encouraging social impact funders to follow the data. I think that data, we have an amazing data professional on the Morgridge Family Foundation team who I'm happy to connect you directly with. Her name's Elizabeth Wilson, and she lives in this world of data and communicating data and how it can be used to influence and inspire action. I'll share that in my graduate program and professional career, data in social impact is really tricky because measuring outputs and activities is easy. Measuring outcomes is really hard, meaning that, and funders can often want to see those outcomes. So I'm just making up an example, but if I'm trying to solve for homelessness in my neighborhood of Logan Circle in Washington, DC, the ways that I do that in way of maybe raising money or ensuring that I'm handing out X amount of blankets, that's really easy to measure. The actual outcome of that, the social problem, is really tricky because social problems are rapidly evolving and can face unpredicted crises like COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an extreme example, but it could be weather or something that impacts that social problem. So more and more, I've been thinking about the importance of talking about the data that I have on my outputs and activities, or the stuff that I'm doing tactically to solve the social problem, even more so than the outcome itself, because I think it's harder to ultimately measure. It's not a great, that's a big question that I'd love to think, to steal my answer from before, that I'd love to think more about and get back to you on. But again, I'm happy to, I think the answer is yes, there should be a place for data in way of communicating effectively. I think that with donors, especially, there tend to be head and heart folks. So people who want to either be moved to tears and really want that emotional piece. And then there are folks who really like who want the fast and hard data and numbers to and it's not an either or, it should be a blend of those two most times. But I think being prepared to have data to back your story up, as well as being able to have more narrative anecdotes to back your mission and your point up, your message up, are really good tools to have in your belt. Ideally, you blend them together as you communicate that why and what that we talked about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I feel like the most effective organizations have done that. They'll take that anecdote and use it as a way to illustrate the data point that they're trying to meet. But it is, as you say, it's very complicated because depending on what you measure and how you measure, and some things are easier to measure than others, and then you can't measure a negative. How many people were not without housing tonight, based on you don't really know. You can kind of look at a trend perhaps, but that doesn't maybe tell the story in the same way. So it's hard.
Yeah, and I mean, to go back to the Smithsonian podcast example, I'm thinking about how that was born from this brand challenge that the Smithsonian has around familiarity and, let's see if I can still do this, familiarity and awareness. So awareness is name recognition, familiarity is what's behind the name. And what we found was name recognition was super high. It was in like the 96th percentile. Familiarity, or what went into the brand of the Smithsonian, was much lower. It was like 40%. So the way you used to communicate that is the Smithsonian has the same brand recognition as Kleenex. The only difference is that people know what to do with Kleenex. They're not quite sure what to do with the Smithsonian. And so, Kevin, to your point, that's taking data, right? Like that, what I just said is taking data and then translating it into a more captivating, like accessible kind of bite that I could talk about, and the quantitative minded folks would be able to wrap their heads around that and get the information that they needed. And then folks who were a little bit more anecdotal also had a metaphor that was kind of funny and relevant and would allow them to understand the problem as well.
That's great. That's a really helpful illustration. So speaking of the podcast again, could you elaborate for a bit on how you use different kinds of communication, whether it's podcast or social media, and and how that relates back to your authenticity and your story that you're telling, especially from the nonprofit side? How can you harness the tools around evolving communication to best keep, or have what's the reality check that you want to run all of your communications by, as you want to make sure that they're aligned with the authentic values that you're trying to present to the world? Yeah. Yep.
And I'm looking at Morgridge Family Foundation's communication manager, who's also has joined us today, Kelsey Thompson, who would have amazing answers to this question. Mine goes back to my presentation. I always, I never set out to create a podcast. I never set out to create an accelerator program, which is what I've been fortunate to build at the Morgridge Family Foundation. I always went back to what's the problem I'm trying to solve. And I share that because I think the trap can be, we should create a podcast because they're hot and flashy, or we should have a Twitter channel and blast information because it's what brands are expected to do, or we should create a bunch of videos because we should have more video content, rather than saying we need to reach folks in ways that are going to make the museum collections more accessible to people who can't visit us in Washington, D.C., or how can we showcase the people behind our stuff through a video series? It goes, if we can really, when we're creating content, if we can look at that problem we're trying to solve and let that drive the way that we then feed our audiences different content, I think it makes it much more compelling as a brand and as a value proposition than creating content for the sake of industry expectations or for the sake of feeling like it's the right thing to do for our organization. Is that helpful, April?
Yeah, I think that definitely touches on the point. And I do feel like, again, especially if you're a smaller nonprofit, if you don't have a communication staff team, it's tempting to want to have all of those channels active and you feel like it's expected. And, but then if you have the channel, but it goes silent for too long, that's a whole nother issue. But if you've applied for funding, I imagine most funders will, they'll look at your website to kind of get an idea of who you are. They'll look at your social media. So they're going to want to kind of understand what you're doing in that space. Have you seen on the funding side, have you seen that example?
So tell me if this is helpful, but I'm thinking about as a funder, what I look for even more than communication channels as an indicator of credibility for an organization. I ask, does that organization have a clear, proximate understanding of their audience? And what I mean by that is, if I'm working with a grassroots organization and they don't have social media channels, but they communicate to me that we're working in South Africa with communities around Kruger National Park, I'm thinking of an organization called Global Conservation Corps, and we know that text message is the best way to reach our audience. So while we may not have a Twitter or a Facebook page, what we do have is 900 phone numbers that we send 5 text messages to a week. And as a result, we have seen increased activities and outputs from those, like that understanding of audience and how people in a place want to receive information rather than conforming to mainstream communication channels is much more compelling to me as a funder than anything else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Having the right tool for the right occasion and not just every tool. Again, it's kind of not trying to be all things to all funders.
And talking about it and owning that and saying, look, we decided, we're a small, nimble team and we're trying to solve this problem. And so we went out into the community and tried to understand how do you want to, what's the best way for you to get information? And then we responded to that rather than putting our resources in other places that would be great because it would increase our reach and our and the awareness that we would have from others around the world. But really in solving this problem right now, we are focused on meeting our audience where they're at and then inspiring them into action, which we've been successful at. I would much rather hear that than see, Instagram and TikTok and other social media platforms taking off for a small, nimble team.
Yeah, and on that note, and I'm guessing you probably ran into this, especially with the Smithsonian podcast project and other things that you were doing with the Smithsonian. But as the Simmons Center for Global Chicago, we try to take a very global perspective, and I imagine the what values are presented and how you come across it can vary a lot in different cultures and in different circumstances. And how do you stay true to your authentic values while also trying to reach audiences that might, do you have to worry about how your values are interpreted in other cultures and, without losing your authenticity, but being aware of crafting your message in a way that doesn't, that doesn't become so generic that it means nothing anymore, but you're still aware of not wanting to act in a way that might be insensitive in a different culture and different cultural context.
So it makes me think of two things. The first is I feel very fortunate that, and I believe that my values of optimism and empathy and honesty and trust, that those actually cut across cultures. What becomes, and I've been fortunate to present throughout my career on 5 or 6 continents and cultures spanning Tunisia and Armenia and Poland and Taiwan. And I think that's where the self-regulation piece of authentic leadership becomes really important. It's understanding how can my values show up in a way that's appropriate. And then that leads to positive modeling, which is that final piece where we can be perceived by others as being authentic leaders. So, in embodying our values. So I think the answer is values shouldn't change. I think that's what makes a person authentic and attractive to be around and collaborate with. When it comes to collaborating with other cultures, it's that self-regulation piece of understanding how can my values show up in a way that's appropriate. And that's not a compromise, that's self-regulation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. I also wanted to ask you, you have outlined a lot of strategies, a lot of helpful ideas. Do you have more specific recommendations if audience members want to dive deeper into some of these strategies or want to learn more about, are there resources and tools that are out there that you'd like to share?
Sure. So Dr. Susan Harder out of the University of Denver, she's kind of like the leader in authenticity. So if anybody's interested in nerding out over either scholarly research, she's published a few books. I would recommend reading some pieces by her. There's an amazing TED Talk that I thought about showing as part of my presentation. I wrote it down. It's called How to Start a Movement. It's 10 minutes or so, and I would encourage everyone to watch it. So it's a TED Talk called How to Start a Movement. But I would say dig a little deeper into Dr. Susan Harder out of the University of Denver, and then a TED Talk called How to Start a Movement, and then do the work. Think to yourself, spend some time reflecting on what your values are, and then start to notice how they show up or not in the way that you interact with others. I also see, and it feels like I planted this question, but I didn't. I see Kevin has asked, can you talk about the accelerator program and how we could apply to join? Absolutely, I'd love to talk about I'd love to talk about this for hours and hours, but I'll try to be brief. The Morgridge Acceleration Program, or we refer to it as MAP, started from this question around how could we do 3 things. How could we provide additional human capital to nonprofits in our network? How could we get them more people to help them solve the problems that they face? We also noticed that the professional development dollars that go towards social sector professionals is almost nil when compared to the private and public sectors. And then third, the importance of social capital. So the people and networks that social impact professionals are connected to, how important that is for influencing great change. So with those 3 problems, MAP was born. And what we do, our core program, and I'm going to put the discovermap.org. Oops. Our website is discovermap.org. So you can read more about this work there. But our core program, there's 3 of them, but our kind of flagship initiative is called the MAP Fellowship. And what we do is we find amazing nonprofit leaders. I would encourage anyone who's listening. Unfortunately, at this time, we only take domestically based organizations. So you can be doing work globally, but a requirement is that you are based in the United States. And we ask, if you had 26 hours in the day, what's the problem that you would solve that would take your organization to the next level? And then we find emerging social impact leaders who are hungry for an opportunity, it's not an upskilling program, it's about unlocking and unleashing proven potential. So we find folks who have been kicking butt early in their career, and then we invest in them radically through all kinds of professional development, experiences, travel opportunities, mentorship, as they solve a problem facing your nonprofit organization, while we build a network between this cohort. So it's called the MAP Fellowship. For anybody who that sounds interesting to, would love to learn more, we're actually going to be opening our applications for nonprofit executives who are called mentors in the program, MAP Mentors, shortly. So there's an email address that's, I believe, my colleague Ash Gallegos, who's our wonderful, wonderful program manager, that you can reach out to. I encourage you to look at the website, learn a little bit more, and then reach out if you think it might be a good fit for you at this time.
That sounds terrific. And I think the strategy of investing in capacity, in staffing, in skill building and professional development, and kind of the infrastructure and administration and overhead, things that a lot of funders shy away from. I hats off to the Morgridge Family Foundation for knowing that that's actually a piece that can really move the needle for a lot of nonprofits. So that's really helpful.
I mean, hats off. John and Carrie Morgridge felt really strongly about exactly that, April. So I feel really fortunate to have stewarded their idea and have been able to brought this program to life.
That's great. Well, I will just put one more call out. If anybody has a question that they would like to raise a hand for or drop in the chat. And in the meantime, I am going to, we'll be sure to share with you all of the as I said, the presentation, but also we'll get the links to the TED Talk that you mentioned and Dr. Susan Carter's information. And if there are other things that you think of, Tony, if you send them along, we'll make sure and get them out to all of the participants, along with the recording to everyone who couldn't be here. I'm also going to just put all of the websites for MENTEE Global, for the Simmons Center, and for the Morgridge Family Foundation into the chat. If we don't have any other questions, I think we can just wrap it up by, do you have anything else you want to add, Tony? And then we'll close this out.
No, I just want to make sure that I thank Letitia and the wonderful, wonderful staff at MENTEE, as well as April, you and your colleagues at the Simmons Center. I feel so grateful to have had the opportunity to chat with all of you and get to know your work better, and to share a bit of my experience and journey as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, that's terrific. And yes, Jill, I see you've got your hand up. If you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute, it's another Simmons Center member, Jill McDonough.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to ask one question, Tony. First of all, thank you so much. This is so helpful. When there's a global organization with multiple sisters and brothers and arms and legs, do you have any tips for making that message stick when there's a tendency for different groups across the globe to go in different directions?
Do you mean, Jill, just so I understand, like a decentralized organization? Is that
a centralized organization, but that has multiple chapters, if you will, in fundraising organizations across the globe?
Yep. In my experience, it comes down to relationships, and in a centralized organization that has lots of chapters around the globe, ensuring that the approach of collaboration is not top down, or here's an idea and now here's how we're going to implement it, but knowing people before you need people and really putting in the time. And I know it can be challenging when we're all strapped for time, our greatest resource, but really building authentic relationships with those individuals so that when there is an idea, when it comes, or a new initiative or regulation or shift that is trying to be made, when you're engaging with them or trying to sell that idea, if you will, it doesn't feel like every time they see an email from you or every time you're talking, it's going to be an ask, but rather you're really a trusted friend and partner that they then feel pleased to support. And that takes work and time, but I hope that's helpful, but that's been my approach throughout my career.
Thank you.
Yeah, and listening, always listening to folks.
Yeah, I always tend to think about the smaller nonprofits that don't have the staff, but there's equal and very different challenges for the much larger nonprofits that have staffing capacity, but that are so spread out that it becomes a more complicated, a different type of complicated question to answer. So that's really helpful.
Totally.
And Kevin, I see you got your hand up. If you want to take yourself off mute, go ahead.
Yeah, so just real quickly, I'd like to thank you again, Tony and April and all the organizations and individuals that made this possible. I thought this was really productive. So in closing, where can we go from here? In other words, could we have follow-up with these ideas? I think connections between the organizations involved, Tony, your organization and the Simmons Center, and clearly this the turnout for this event was very strong. I know that there were other people who are really interested in being here and who couldn't. So yeah, I think this was a great success. And where can we go and how can we continue this collaboration?
Sure. I mean, my email address, and I'll speak, April, I'll allow you to speak for your organization, but my email is on the Morgridge Family Foundation website. I'm also happy to put it in the chat. I'm more than happy to always continue the conversation for anything that really resonated with folks. I would say that what I always appreciate in any follow-up is something like a specific, I rather than, and this is just a general, I guess, piece of advice, but rather than an email that says, I really enjoyed our conversation, would love to jump on a call and continue it. I always appreciate when somebody says, hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. I have been thinking more about this thing and how I can apply it. Would you mind jumping on a call to brainstorm? Or I saw that on your LinkedIn. They're like being really specific with a call to action for a conversation is always most compelling to me, rather than continuing for the sake of for something more broad. But where do we go from here? I'm always happy to continue chatting with folks that ideas resonate with and who believe I could add some kind of value or benefit to the impact that they're trying to make. And encourage everybody to check out the Morgridge Family Foundation website, read our annual report, and learn more about the Mortgage Acceleration Program as well. April, I'll toss it.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you so much. I want to just reiterate how grateful we are for everyone who did attend today, and we will look forward to sharing all of the resources. Thanks for taking your time to be here in community with us. And Tony, thank you especially to you for your time and expertise. Clearly, everybody, I think we've all learned a lot and sparked a lot of ideas to see us go forward down these pathways. And so on behalf of MENTEE and the Simmons Center for Global Chicago, I just want to thank you again for your session. You can learn more about MENTEE and the Simmons Center, as well as the Morgridge Family Foundation, through the website links that I put into the chat. You can always reach out to April at simmonsglobal.org if you have questions or if you need follow-up contacts after this. And I hope everybody enjoyed your time, and thank you for coming, and appreciate all the nice messages that are dropping in the chat now. So thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, April.